They told her to step aside, not with a shout, not with anger, but with a soft smile and a quiet insistence that made the humiliation cut deeper. A black woman in clean civilian clothes, standing tall despite the stiff drag of her artificial leg, was told her first-class seat was no longer available. No explanation, no apology, just a gate agent's gaze that slid past her like she was invisible, and a few nods exchanged between staff, as if her presence had violated an unspoken rule. She didn't argue, not because she agreed, but because something in the air told her resistance would only prove whatever judgment they'd already made. What followed was a spiral of silent, calculated cruelty, subtle policies twisted against her, glances that became verdicts, and a quiet, viral betrayal that painted her as a problem before she ever had a chance to speak. But what no one saw coming was the truth, one so powerful it would turn the entire system upside down. This isn't just a story about injustice. It's about what happens when silence is no longer an option. If you're watching, drop a comment to tell us where you're tuning in from. Hit that like button if the story grabs you, and subscribe for more chapters that challenge the way we see the world. Your voice matters, especially here. Inez Wallace waited quietly at gate 14B, standing straight despite the discomfort pinching her lower back and the familiar ache where steel met flesh. She had been early. She was always early. Years of military conditioning had wired her for punctuality, discipline, patience. She stood with her feet shoulder-width apart, one hand gripping the thick leather leash of her service dog, Barlow, the other holding a manila folder containing her boarding pass, military records, and VA accommodations letter. The folder was neat, edges aligned perfectly. Her dark windbreaker was zipped halfway, a plain black cap pulled low over her brow. Her prosthetic leg, matte black with a silver knee joint, made a soft click with every shift of her weight. She felt the eyes. They always came. Not because of the dog, not even because of the uniform tags still stitched into her jacket, but because of the limb. People stared when they thought she wouldn't notice. Some looked away quickly. Others let their gaze linger too long. A young couple seated across the gate leaned into each other, whispering as they looked her way. She kept her face unreadable, her breath steady. Barlow sat calmly at her heel, tongue in, gaze scanning the moving shapes and shuffling feet. He was a presence of certainty, trained for worse than this, but still a creature with a soul. She bent slightly, brushed his neck once, then stood upright again. Her group was called, not with a name, just a number. Group 1, First Class. She walked forward, gliding more than striding, every move deliberate. The boarding agent, a young man in his 30s with a faded tattoo half visible on his wrist, looked down at her boarding pass, then up at her face, then lower, to her leg. He blinked once. She held the pass out toward him. He didn't take it. Not immediately. He squinted at the paper, then back at her again, then at the leash. "This is for first class?" His tone was casual, almost light. She nodded once. "It was booked through the VA priority program," she said in a steady voice. "Accommodations were filed. The airline has the documentation." The man gave a small chuckle that didn't reach his eyes. He didn't move. "Yeah, I just want to double-check something." He turned to his left, speaking over the counter to a woman in a dark blazer and tight bun who came walking over with purposeful steps. She glanced at Inez, scanned the boarding pass he showed her, then stared again at Barlow, and finally down at the prosthetic. The pause between each look was cold. She leaned closer to him and murmured something low enough that Inez couldn't catch it, then straightened and addressed her for the first time. "There's been a correction," the woman said. "Your seat was reassigned to another row. Please follow the red line to the left." "Excuse me," Inez said, her voice still even but tighter now. "My seat was arranged 2 weeks ago through Veterans Affairs. My leg requires front row access. It's documented and already approved." The woman blinked twice. "That was likely a clerical error," she said. "We can't always guarantee special requests." She handed the boarding pass back without meeting Inez's eyes. "Proceed to the rear of the aircraft. You'll be seated in 28E." Inez didn't move. The woman glanced at her watch. "You'll need to go now. You're holding up the line." The man behind Inez gave a small cough of impatience. Another woman whispered something under her breath. Barlow shifted slightly but stayed grounded. Inez gave the leash a gentle nudge and moved forward without another word. The jet bridge smelled like rubber and metal and recycled air. She passed the open door of the cockpit, the blur of white uniforms and blinking consoles barely catching her attention. No one greeted her. No one guided her. At the aisle, she turned left as instructed, walking deeper into the narrow corridor of the aircraft, brushing shoulders, squeezing between elbows and bags. Her leg caught on a seat corner as she passed, jarring the socket. She didn't flinch. Barlow moved smoothly beside her, weaving through passengers without hesitation. Near the rear, a man stood in the aisle, adjusting his headphones, blocking the row. She cleared her throat. He looked her up and down, then stepped aside with exaggerated slowness. She nodded once and moved in. Her assigned seat was the middle, no window, no legroom. The tray was cracked. The armrest was sticky. The overhead bin was full. She bent to slide her bag under the seat, but her knee joint wouldn't bend enough, not at that angle. She tried again. A flight attendant passed and paused. "Bags have to go all the way in," she said without stopping. "No exceptions." Inez looked up, opened her mouth, then shut it. She pulled her bag sideways and jammed it into the limited space, her back protesting. Barlow pressed himself under the seat in front of her, barely fitting. The man beside her gave a long exhale and muttered something too low to catch. The plane filled. Passengers joked, fumbled with bags, texted. No one looked at her again. The cabin felt tighter than usual. She stared straight ahead. The same flight attendant passed again, handing out sanitizing wipes. She skipped Inez's row. The woman next to her tapped her nails against the armrest. When Barlow's head nudged slightly out from under the seat, she recoiled and hissed. "Watch it," she snapped, loud enough for the attendant to hear. Inez gently tapped Barlow's collar, coaxing him further back, though there was nowhere else for him to go. No one offered assistance. No one asked if she needed more space. The announcements began. "Welcome aboard. We appreciate your loyalty. Flight time is 3 hours and 47 minutes. She sat with her knees awkwardly turned, her shoulders aching from tension. The engines roared to life. The plane began its crawl. The woman beside her sprayed something floral into the air and turned her face away. The man on her other side had adjusted his elbow to dominate the shared armrest, his bulky forearm nudging into her ribs every time he scrolled through his phone with loud, jabbing swipes. Inez said nothing. She shifted slightly, not to reclaim her space, but to find a position where the pressure on her residual limb wouldn't pulse so sharply. She had endured discomfort before, but the silence here was not empty. It was thick. It carried the weight of 1,000 judgments wrapped in polite quiet. An attendant passed with a cart, pausing to serve the row ahead. Water, soda, a packaged cookie. She asked if they needed anything. She smiled. She moved forward. She did not stop at 28E. Inez leaned her head back against the seat and opened her mouth to ask for water, but the words dried up before reaching her tongue. The attendant was already 2 rows ahead, chatting now with a passenger who had asked for orange juice. The woman beside her reached into her purse and pulled out a tissue, dabbing her nose as if reacting to a sudden unpleasant smell. She leaned slightly away from Inez, not enough to be overt, but enough to communicate discomfort. The man to her right had begun to snore softly, head tilted against the window, oblivious or uninterested in the tension between the other two. Barlow adjusted his head and exhaled slowly, the dog's breath warm against the thin fabric covering Inez's boot. She reached down slowly, brushing his neck once, a single motion for reassurance neither of them needed, but both understood. The flight continued, each minute stretching into a quiet standoff. Inez watched the seatbelt sign flicker off and on again. The aircraft swayed slightly, a tremor in the air that made drink cups rattle. She kept her body still, jaw locked. A new attendant approached from her rear, this one younger, hair swept up neatly, apron crisp. Her eyes scanned the cabin. When they landed on Inez, her smile faltered slightly. She stopped beside the row, then turned toward the woman on the aisle. "Would you like anything?" she asked, tone soft but clear. "Just a tea," the woman said, glancing toward Inez as if reminding the attendant of something unsaid. The attendant's gaze dropped to Barlow, then to Inez's knee. "Is he a working dog?" she asked. Inez nodded once. "He's trained and registered." "Does he have paperwork?" Inez reached into the folder still wedged under her seat and produced the necessary documentation, handing it over wordlessly. The attendant scanned it quickly, nodding. "We've just had complaints about allergies," she added, eyes flicking back to the woman beside her. "We'll need to make sure he remains under the seat completely." Inez stared forward. "He hasn't moved," she said, voice flat. "He's within regulation." The attendant didn't respond, only returned the paper and walked away without another word. The woman beside her gave a quiet, smug little sigh and leaned closer to the aisle. Her shoulder brushed Inez's, not in aggression, but in subtle reassertion. Space mattered, territory mattered, and Inez had been reduced to a tolerated presence rather than a passenger. The man beside her stirred awake, glanced at his phone, then looked directly at Inez. His eyes narrowed, scanning her face, then the prosthetic, then the service dog. Without a word, he shifted his body toward her, leaned in slightly, and stared. Not long, not dramatically, but long enough that the skin at the back of her neck prickled. His gaze was cold, and his lip curled in faint distaste. Then he pulled out his phone and began typing, one-handed, never glancing away. Inez turned her head slowly to the window, though there was no view. Only the wall of the aircraft pressed inches from her temple. There was nowhere else to turn. Another tremor rolled through the plane. The overhead light above her seat flickered. Someone a few rows ahead coughed, loudly and without restraint. The woman on her left raised her tissue again, this time dramatically fanning the air in front of her nose. Barlow shifted again, curling tighter. A steward passed through with trash bags, ignoring her outstretched hand until she quietly placed the wrapper on the edge of her tray. He stopped, took it without comment, and moved on. The minutes ticked by. She looked at her watch. Still more than 2 hours of flight remaining. 2 hours of this. She could feel the sweat beneath her collar. The fabric itched. Her shoulders cramped. Her leg had gone almost numb from the way she had twisted it. But she didn't move. She stayed silent. It wasn't shame. It wasn't fear. It was the understanding that anything she said, anything she did, would be seen as escalation. The only way to endure was to disappear. But even invisibility did not protect her from the stares. The woman on her left pressed the attendant call button. When the steward arrived, she leaned in and whispered. The attendant looked at Inez, then Barlow, then back to the woman. The woman nodded slightly, a silent exchange. Barlow lay coiled tightly under the seat in front of her, barely able to shift, and every time he did, the woman on Inez's left let out a sharp exhale or adjusted her blanket, as if he were an insect she couldn't quite swat away. The man on her right had now fallen back into a light doze, arms crossed, one foot jabbing into the tight floor space, partially on top of her own. She said nothing. She didn't shift him off. The discomfort of his foot was easier to bear than the potential consequences of being perceived as confrontational. There were rules in the air, unspoken ones. Rules about whose comfort mattered, about who could speak, who could claim space, and who was expected to simply endure. Inez knew those rules. She had lived under them her entire life, even while wearing the uniform, even while bleeding in foreign sand, even while saving lives. None of it mattered now. Here, she was simply an inconvenience, one best dealt with quietly. The drink service had already passed again, skipping her row once more under the pretense of limited supply. She watched a man 3 rows up receive a second cup of coffee. When she tried to make eye contact with the nearest attendant, the woman looked through her like she wasn't there. It was a skill, that kind of erasure. You had to be practiced in it. Inez knew the expression well. It had been used on her in banks, in waiting rooms, in elevators. in meetings where her words had value until people saw who spoke them. Now on this plane, it manifested again, subtle and exacting. An hour from their scheduled landing, turbulence struck, not harsh, but persistent enough to jostle cups and make the cabin lights flicker. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, clipped and calm, issuing instructions to return to seats and fasten belts. Inez had never unbuckled hers. Her body had stayed locked in place the entire flight, not from safety, but from necessity. Movement invited attention. Attention risked scrutiny. And scrutiny brought consequences. The woman beside her muttered about air sickness and pressed the call button twice in quick succession. When an attendant finally arrived, the woman complained about the smell of dog hair and said the animal was causing her nausea. The attendant nodded without acknowledging Inez, who was sitting inches away, hearing every word but being addressed by no one. When the woman asked if she could be reseated, the attendant offered a tight smile and said the flight was full, but perhaps on the return trip they could arrange something more comfortable. The woman nodded and then turned toward Inez with a look that said more than words ever could. As the attendant walked away, the woman pushed her blanket further over the shared armrest, as though needing to establish final territorial control. The snoring man beside Inez stirred and yawned, then glanced at her with mild irritation, as if she had been the one responsible for the light shaking or the lack of airspace. He adjusted his collar, leaned in toward the aisle, and shifted so far over that his elbow hit her side, knocking her balance slightly. She blinked but didn't react. She pulled Barlow's leash closer and whispered his name gently. He responded by adjusting his head, but she could feel the tension under his coat, the stress building in the animal's body from being cramped too long. He was trained for long flights, for crowds, for conflict. But even he had limits. And today, they were being tested without the chaos of noise or action, just neglect. Her shoulder blades ached as the minutes dragged by. Her mouth was dry. No one had offered water. No one had asked her name, or if she needed anything. They didn't need to say it out loud. Their message was clear. She didn't belong here. When the cart came around again, the man beside her asked for another soda. The attendant smiled, handed it to him, and moved on. Inez raised her hand, not high, just enough to be noticed. The attendant glanced back, hesitated, then continued forward. A woman in the row behind her tapped the attendant and asked for pretzels. A few were handed over, and the woman glanced toward Inez's row, then turned back with a shrug. She didn't offer to help. She didn't ask if Inez had been forgotten. She had seen what the others had seen. That Inez was outside the circle of service. Her presence was tolerated, not welcomed. Her rights were technicalities, not expectations. The air in the cabin felt heavier now, thicker, as though she were breathing through cloth. Her prosthetic itched, but she couldn't reach to adjust it in the tight space. She could feel the heat radiating from her torso, the signs of a body trying to stay controlled under pressure. Her heart was steady, but her jaw was clenched. It had been clenched for nearly 2 hours now. Her arms were folded across her stomach, fingers pressed into the fabric of her windbreaker. A voice came on the speaker announcing a delay in landing due to weather. The flight would circle for 20 more minutes. Audible groans rose from the cabin. The woman beside her rolled her eyes and pulled the scented mask over her face again. The man to her right huffed and shifted noisily, his elbow once again jabbing her ribs. The dog stirred. Inez leaned down to soothe him, barely able to move in the narrow space. When she looked up, a steward was staring at her, not helping, just watching. His face was unreadable, but his arms were crossed. When he turned away, she felt colder than before. She looked around the cabin and saw no faces returning her gaze. Barlow remained dutiful beneath her feet, though she could feel the tremors in his breathing each time the cabin temperature shifted, and his ribcage pressed harder into the floor. He had been still for too long, even by his standards, and his discomfort was now matching her own. Inez's lower back ached from leaning awkwardly to avoid brushing the passenger on either side of her, who had both treated her existence like an intrusion, never acknowledging her except with a scoff or a glance. When the turbulence hit again, harder this time, Her body jerked against the seatbelt, and her hips slammed against the metal frame with enough force to make her wince. She closed her eyes for a moment, drawing in air through her nose, focusing on breath and silence, pushing the pain into a corner of her mind she had built for exactly this kind of moment. The cabin lights flickered briefly, and the murmurs of the other passengers filled the aisle. Complaints about the delay turned into small groans of discomfort, calls for attendance, and whispered grievances. Flight staff walked by briskly, one of them pushing a cart with supplies. As they neared Inez's row, she straightened slightly, not to draw attention, but to show readiness. She needed water. She hadn't had any since she boarded. The air was dry, her throat raw, and the throbbing in her temples warned her of dehydration. As the cart passed, she caught the eye of one of the flight attendants, a short man with a perfectly clipped beard and pressed collar. He looked at her, eyes lingering on the prosthetic before quickly darting away. She raised 2 fingers not abruptly, but clearly, signaling a request. He turned his head to the other side of the cart, poured water for the passengers in the adjacent row, and moved forward without a word. No nod, no acknowledgement, as if she had never lifted her hand. She lowered it slowly, fingers curling into a loose fist on her lap. Her lips were cracked, and she could feel the slight pulse in the side of her neck growing stronger. Still, she said nothing. Another cart passed a few rows behind, and once again she tried to signal, this time making direct eye contact with a younger attendant, perhaps newer, who looked toward her but then shifted her gaze to the woman beside Inez, who pretended to cough into her mask again, her face twisted in exaggerated discomfort. The attendant slowed, possibly unsure, but the woman beside Inez whispered something too soft to catch, and then the cart moved on without stopping. The message was reinforced again. Others' discomfort held more weight than Inez's need. Her pain, her medical condition, her service, even her presence, could all be reduced to the background noise of other people's imagined inconveniences. She reached down to adjust her socks slightly, trying to relieve the burning sensation where her skin pressed against the prosthetic socket. The movement caused Barlow to shift with her, and in doing so, his nose briefly nudged the blanket hanging off the seat in front of her. A child seated there squealed suddenly and yanked his legs up. His mother turned around with a look of pure irritation, then narrowed her eyes at Inez. She said nothing but mouthed a curse, clearly blaming Inez for her child's momentary surprise. Inez opened her mouth to explain that the dog had simply shifted, nothing more, but the woman had already turned back around, muttering now to her husband. Moments later, a steward returned to their row. He crouched down beside Inez, close enough for her to hear him over the hum of the plane. "We've received another complaint," he said quietly, though not with any sense of empathy. "Please make sure the animal remains fully contained. You're responsible for maintaining passenger comfort." Inez stared at him. Her throat was too dry to argue. She nodded once, not out of agreement, but out of necessity. The steward stood and walked away. She looked down at Barlow, whose eyes met hers with the same calm patience he always held, as if reminding her that survival sometimes required surrender. The delay stretched on. The seatbelt light remained on, trapping her in this same confined hell. Around her, the passengers shifted and sighed. The man beside her had resumed his snoring, mouth open now, breath sharp and stale. The woman to her left tapped her foot in a restless rhythm, glancing every few seconds at the nearest flight attendant like she might signal some emergency of discomfort. Inez sat perfectly still, every part of her body aching for motion, for air, for something to acknowledge she was more than a silhouette occupying space. The cart returned once more, this time with trash bags. Inez raised the empty wrapper she had saved from earlier, hoping for a chance to make some form of polite exchange. The flight attendant took the wrapper, without speaking, never looking at her, and continued down the aisle. When the cart passed again, later with headsets and forms for connecting passengers, her row was skipped. No one asked if she had a connection. No one offered her a headset. No one asked if she needed assistance deplaning. The older woman behind her leaned forward at one point, tapping the seat. "Excuse me," she said, not to Inez, but over her shoulder to the attendant walking by. How much longer do we have to deal with the dog? The steward looked to Inez, then to Barlow, then smiled at the woman behind her. We'll be landing shortly, he said. Thank you for your patience. No defense. No reminder that the dog was a trained service animal. Just a smile to the woman who had treated Inez's medical necessity like a pest. Her hands clenched beneath the tray table. Her breath was shallow now, controlled. Every request denied. Every small comfort withheld. Not by accident, but by collective decision. The passengers had chosen to pretend she didn't exist, and the staff had agreed. And that agreement had grown into policy, not written, but understood. Ignore her. Inconvenience her. Minimize her needs until she simply accepts that nothing more will be offered. Seat belts clicked open. Limbs stretched into aisles. Voices rose again into the stale air with the kind of casual relief that belonged to those who traveled in comfort, unbothered by scrutiny, unburdened by visibility. The woman beside her stood and reached for her bag, deliberately letting the corner of it knock against Inez's shoulder as she yanked it from the overhead bin. No apology came, only a backward glance of dismissive indifference. The man on her right stretched with a loud groan and blocked the aisle with his body, preventing Inez from even attempting to exit. She remained seated, waiting for a gap, her restraint now so habitual it felt like armor. A flight attendant walked down the aisle, counting seats, her tablet raised. When she reached Inez's row, she stopped, eyes flicking to the prosthetic. You'll need to wait until the main aisle is clear, she said, not unkindly, but firmly, as though delivering a safety instruction rather than a command born of bias. It's for your own comfort. Inez didn't argue. She nodded once and kept her eyes straight ahead. As the rows ahead of her began to empty, the energy in the cabin grew chaotic. Passengers pulling luggage, bumping elbows, voicing impatience. When it was finally her turn to stand, she did so slowly, gripping the seat in front of her to steady herself. The motion sent a jolt up her back and into her hip, and she clenched her jaw against the wave of pain. Barlow rose beside her, obedient and alert, his frame brushing against her calf as he waited for her next move. She stepped into the aisle, careful and deliberate, guiding her body through the narrow space. Her duffel hung heavily from one shoulder, but she didn't ask for assistance. No one had offered. As she neared the front of the aircraft, a new flight attendant, a tall man with a sharp jaw and a fixed expression, stepped into her path. Hold on, he said, glancing down at a device. We've had some observations from crew regarding your animal. His voice was low, measured, and entirely without warmth. We're required to do a quick post-flight check. Just stay right there. Inez paused, uncertain, her hands tightening slightly on the leash. Barlow is a registered service dog, she said calmly. All documentation was submitted before boarding. It's just protocol, the man replied quickly. Shouldn't take more than a minute. But he didn't move. He just stood there, as though expecting her to react in a way that would justify something. After a few seconds of silence, another attendant approached, this one a woman with a folder and a neutral smile that didn't reach her eyes. We've had a passenger express concern that your dog may have moved outside the designated area during a flight, she said. It's a minor issue, but we're obligated to log it. Inez blinked, her mouth dry. He shifted once to adjust under the seat. He didn't block the aisle. He didn't disrupt anyone. It's not about that, the woman said. It's about perception. Passengers feel things differently. That phrase struck deeper than any turbulence. Perception. Not truth. Not facts. Perception. She felt a flicker of heat rise in her throat, a tightness that threatened to crack the controlled mask she'd worn for hours. She forced it back down. Do you need to inspect him? She asked, voice flat. No, the man replied. But we do need you to complete an incident form. Down at the gate. It's quick. The request wasn't really a request. She was being pulled aside, singled out again. A final humiliation to punctuate the string of denials that had defined this entire flight. She glanced toward the open cabin door. Passengers streamed past without looking at her, their faces indifferent. The space that had once been hers in first class now existed only as a denial echoing through every inch of her body. She followed the attendants without a word, limping slightly now as the pressure in her hip worsened. Barlow moved quietly beside her, his leash wrapped loosely around her fingers. At the gate, she was directed to a small counter just to the side of the terminal hallway, where two more airline staff stood waiting. One held a tablet. The other watched her approach with the wary alertness of someone trained to expect trouble. "Name," the one with the tablet asked. She gave it. He typed. "Veteran status?" "Army." "Medical discharge," she replied. "VA ID available." "Do you have proof of deployment?" the other asked, without explanation. Inez stared at him. "That's not required for domestic air travel," she said. "It's not relevant." "Just part of the form," he said. "We've had some travelers misrepresent themselves before." The insinuation sat between them like a whetstone. Heavy. Disgusting. She reached into her folder again and produced the ID. He took it, scanned it, then returned it without comment. The other typed something else into the device. "Your complaint will be noted, but for now you're free to go." Not thanked. Not acknowledged. Just dismissed. As she turned away, dragging her limp leg toward the exit, she passed a group of passengers still clustered near the luggage carousel. One of them, a middle-aged woman with a scarf and large sunglasses, pointed at Inez and whispered something to her companion. They both turned and stared. It wasn't curiosity. It was that same look from the plane. The look that said, "You shouldn't be here. You don't belong in our space." She held her head higher, not out of pride, but because lowering it would have meant surrendering something even more valuable than comfort: her silence. She walked through the terminal slowly, every movement deliberate, every muscle burning with effort. Her body had endured long deployments, field surgeries, and battlefield trauma. But this routine journey, this simple flight, had stripped her of more than a uniform ever had. She felt the scarring now not on her leg, but in the subtle, invisible places. The ones no doctor could stitch or scan. They had not yelled at her. They had not cursed her. But now, as she reached down and gently stroked the top of Barlow's head, she felt it in the deepest layer of her body, more than pain in her leg or fatigue in her bones. It was the weight of being stripped of dignity in front of others who believed they were better at hiding what they thought of people like her. A shuttle arrived to take passengers to the long-term parking garage, and Inez boarded last, choosing a corner seat near the rear. The driver didn't speak, didn't offer assistance, didn't acknowledge the strain she showed getting up the steps. Barlow followed with practiced discipline, positioning himself at her feet, his nose twitching at the damp rubber floor. The other passengers found seats quickly. A woman in business attire sat directly across from Inez, glancing at her once, then pulling her handbag onto her lap, as though Inez might reach over and take it. A teenage boy 2 seats away turned to look at the dog, then smirked and whispered something to the man beside him. The man chuckled without looking in her direction. The ride was quiet except for the occasional rumble of the engine and the squeal of wet tires. But even in that silence, Inez could feel it happening again. The isolation, the subtle refusal of recognition. The public no longer needed to voice its scorn. It had mastered the art of expressionless judgment. They saw her prosthetic. They saw the dog. They saw her skin. And from those 3 facts alone, they had built a story they were ready to believe, a version of her that required no truth to validate it. When the shuttle reached her stop, she stood carefully, her body stiff from the previous hours of tension. The driver didn't wait to see if she needed help. He opened the doors and stared straight ahead. She climbed down, each step sending a jolt through her back. Barlow descended beside her, his movements fluid but cautious. She crossed the lot in silence, found her car, and stowed her bag. As she sat behind the wheel, gripping it with both hands, she allowed herself to close her eyes. Not to rest, but to gather what remained of her composure. She had felt humiliated before, had been shouted at in public during her recovery, had been called names she never repeated. But those moments had at least shown themselves plainly. This was something else. This was quieter. It was harder to fight because it never quite broke the surface. It left her looking paranoid if she called it out. It made her the problem for noticing it. She drove slowly from the airport, her hands steady on the wheel, but her chest tight. At a gas station an hour later, she pulled over to refill and use the restroom. She walked with a limp more pronounced now, her prosthetic pinching her inner thigh. Barlow stayed by her side, his leash held short. Inside the convenience store, the man behind the counter watched her approach with wary eyes, his hands stilled on the register. He didn't say anything, just scanned her water bottle and handed her the receipt without making contact. On her way out, a woman entered with 2 children. The younger one looked up at Barlow and reached a hand toward his head. Inez gently pulled the leash back. The woman stopped and pulled her children aside. "Let's not get too close," she said, loud enough to be heard. "You never know what kind of dog that is." Inez didn't respond. She walked past them and stepped into the quiet night. She didn't want to cry. Crying would feel like admitting defeat, like surrendering to the judgment of people who hadn't lived her life or earned her scars. But the sting behind her eyes refused to vanish. She hadn't come to this city to be celebrated. She hadn't expected gratitude, but she also hadn't expected this sustained, cold assault on her dignity. Her story had been rewritten in real time by strangers who assumed her silence meant guilt. The following morning, she arrived at the small clinic where she was scheduled to receive her quarterly prosthetic adjustment. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with perfect hair and a clipped voice, barely glanced at her as she slid her insurance card and ID across the counter. "You're early," the woman said. "Please wait until your appointment time. We'll call you." Inez took a seat in the waiting area. Barlow lay down quietly. The television overhead ran a segment about the upcoming Memorial Day celebrations. Parade routes, flyovers, military bands. The screen showed old footage of soldiers saluting, jets in formation. Inez looked up at it, then looked away. No one else in the room spoke to her. The man beside her opened a magazine and turned his back slightly. A nurse walked by, smiled at another patient, then glanced at Inez and continued walking. When she was finally called, the technician didn't offer to help her onto the exam table. He spoke in short, perfunctory phrases, poked at the attachment site of the prosthetic, adjusted the angle, and made notes on a clipboard. "Looks fine," he said. "Try to avoid putting weight on that edge. You're causing your own bruising." She nodded once, biting back the instinct to explain how the plane seat had forced her into that position. She didn't want pity, but she wanted, just once, to be believed without having to provide evidence. After the exam, she stopped at a nearby diner. She hadn't eaten in over a day. The hostess glanced at her limp and pointed toward a small table in the back, near the restroom door. No menu was given. A glass of water arrived without ice. The waitress took her order without writing it down, then brought it out with a lukewarm plate and no utensils. When Inez asked quietly for a fork, the waitress sighed, walked back to the counter, and returned with one wrapped in a napkin without a word. Inez looked down at the food and suddenly wasn't hungry. The insult wasn't loud. It wasn't even clear. It was just persistent. Over and over again, people had made the smallest choices to communicate the same thing, that she was not welcome. Not because of anything she'd done, but because she didn't fit. Her uniform was gone. Her medals weren't pinned to her chest. As she reached the steps, she saw a group of people clustered under the front awning. 3 men in suits, a woman in a tailored coat, and a tall security guard with a clipboard and a stern expression. She approached without fanfare, her appointment confirmation in hand, her documents organized and protected in a clean black folder. As she stepped closer, the security guard shifted to block her path, his hand raising automatically in a gesture not of welcome, but of prevention. "This entrance is for scheduled personnel," he said, his eyes moving from her face to Barlow to the prosthetic and then back to her face again, slower this time. Inez held up the paper. "I have a confirmed slot. Veteran housing paperwork. Filed last month." The man didn't take the paper. He just stared. "You got ID?" She handed it over. He studied it like it might be fake, taking longer than necessary. She stood still. Behind him, The woman in the coat watched with open scrutiny. One of the men leaned in and whispered something that made the others smirk. Inez didn't look at them. She waited. After another long moment, the guard returned her card. "You can go in," he said, "but the dog stays out." The line struck her like a slap. She blinked once, not out of surprise, but out of disbelief that it was still happening here in a government building where the rules were clear and protected by law. "He's a registered service animal," she said slowly. "ADA regulations apply." "Doesn't matter," the guard replied, gesturing to a sign taped beside the door, hastily printed in fading ink. "Only courtroom-designated dogs. No exceptions." Inez had read that policy before. It didn't exist in any legal handbook. It was the kind of rule made up in the moment, flexible enough to apply when convenient. She could argue. She could ask for a supervisor. She could cite the law. But the guard's expression told her what she already knew. He wasn't interested in truth. He was only interested in making her yield. She stepped back and opened the folder. Inside were copies of Barlow's registration, her military discharge, her documentation from the VA, and a laminated letter from the Department of Justice. She handed them over in silence. The guard looked them over, his frown deepening. He didn't apologize. He didn't back down. He just sighed, then nodded once. "Fine. Go in. But don't let him wander." As if Barlow had ever wandered. She passed through the doors, her shoulders square, her pace slow and deliberate. The hallway was wide and cold, lined with benches and bulletin boards full of outdated notices. People turned as she passed, their gazes quick, not curious, just assessing. She had been assessed every day since returning home. Not for her service, not for her sacrifice, but for how well she fit into their expectations. And she never did. At the clerk's window, she was ignored at first, then addressed with clipped words, instructions muttered like they were being wasted on someone unworthy. Her documents were processed without eye contact. She wasn't thanked. No one asked her how long she had served or what she had lost. They stamped her papers, pointed to a bench, and told her to wait. She sat. Barlow curled at her feet. Across from her, a man in khakis and a bomber jacket watched her with narrowed eyes. Then, without warning, he stood and crossed the room. "Are you the one with the dog from a plane yesterday?" he asked, his voice low but clear. Inez didn't answer. Not immediately. She studied him. He looked vaguely familiar. The shape of his face, the way his lips curved downward when he frowned. "I saw the posts," he continued. "The lady next to you? She posted about the flight. Said you caused a delay. Said your dog was out of control." That word, posted, made Inez's stomach turn. She hadn't known. She had suspected whispers, maybe emails between staff. But this was different. This meant someone had photographed her, twisted her silence into aggression, and fed it to an audience eager to believe she was the problem. "You looked calm to me," the man added, shrugging. "But people love a story." Then he walked off, leaving her with a sour taste of betrayal thick in her mouth. She hadn't even been allowed to speak, and already the world had drawn conclusions. She looked down at Barlow. His ears twitched. His head lifted slowly. Someone had made her the villain, not through lies, but through selective truths. A seat, a stare, a moment of movement, and suddenly she was the threat, the outsider, the disruption. She wanted to scream, but her throat was tight. She hadn't been able to tell her side because no one had asked. They had looked at her face, her leg, her skin, and they had written the script for her. Not the story of a soldier, not a survivor, but a disturbance. When her name was finally called, she moved through the doors like a shadow. The official inside was polite but distant, processing the paperwork with bureaucratic indifference. When it was over, she left the building, pushing the door open into bright afternoon light that stung her eyes. She walked down the steps without looking back. As she reached the parking lot, her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. The message contained a screenshot. It was the social media post. A photo of her from behind, seated, leg visible, dog curled beneath her. The caption read, This woman caused a full row disruption and played the veteran card when she got called out. First class ticket wasted. Shouldn't people like this be grateful just to fly? The post had been shared hundreds of times. Commenters chimed in beneath it. Most were cruel. Some laughed. Others nodded in agreement. Only a few questioned the narrative. Inez stared at the screen until it blurred. Then she lowered it slowly, eyes fixed on nothing. Her face burned. Not from shame, but from the helplessness that comes when the lie becomes louder than the truth. Her story had been stolen. She had been erased, then replaced with a version people found easier to believe. The idea that someone had chosen to broadcast her in that moment without her consent, twisting the scene into something shameful, something ugly, churned in her gut. It wasn't just that they had lied, it was that people believed them without question, because believing her would have required more effort, more empathy, and more discomfort than most were willing to give. For the past 3 days, she had endured every form of humiliation in silence, swallowing the hurt, bearing the weight with a quiet discipline that had carried her through years of military service, combat zones, recovery rooms, and rehabilitation centers. But this was different. This wasn't private. This wasn't just the glances and the denial of service, or the unspoken rules that had kept her marginalized. This was public. This was permanent. Her name wasn't tagged in the post, but her face was visible enough, and the caption had been seen by people who knew her, even vaguely. She had received 3 messages already that morning from former colleagues, 2 neutral, 1 laced with doubt. They didn't ask if she was okay. They didn't ask for her version. They just sent the post with silence, trailing behind it like judgment. When she reached her apartment complex, a modest row of brick units on the edge of downtown, she pulled into her spot and sat for a moment, watching as rain pattered on the hood. Barlow shifted beside her in the back seat, sensing her stillness, his ears lifting. She exhaled slowly and opened the door. The chill hit her instantly. She moved toward her unit, climbing the steps one at a time, her leg dragging slightly more than usual. The pain hadn't eased. Her back was sore, her hip bruised, and the knot in her stomach coiled tighter each time she recalled the look on that security guard's face or the way the flight attendant had ignored her extended hand. She opened her front door, stepped inside, and locked it behind her. Then she stood in the hallway, still wearing her jacket, her boots wet from the rain, her hand resting lightly on the wall to steady her body as her mind tipped into motion. She walked to the kitchen and poured herself water, drank half the glass in one swallow, and then set it down with more force than she intended. The sound of it echoed in the silence. She looked around the room and saw her old service plaque on the shelf, dusty now. Her commendations still sat boxed in the closet. The folded flag from her unit's final deployment rested in a frame she had never hung. For years, she had chosen quiet. She had chosen humility. She had chosen to stay small in rooms that refused to make space for her. But now that smallness had been weaponized. Someone had taken her silence as weakness, her restraint as entitlement, and the cost was no longer internal. It had gone viral. She pulled out her laptop, opened the browser, and typed in the platform where the post had gained traction. She searched her image. It appeared instantly, now reshared by a trending gossip account that catered to airport horror stories and complaint threads. The comments section had tripled. People debated her existence like a moral question. Some questioned her right to be in first class. Others mocked her expression, her posture, even the visible shape of her prosthetic. Some said she faked it. Some said she weaponized her dog. She scrolled down and stopped when she saw one comment from a user who had written simply, "This woman is a disgrace to real veterans." That broke something. Not loudly, not all at once, but like a cable snapping beneath the weight of too many years of pressure. She leaned back in her chair and stared at the screen, her hands still and cold. Then she opened her files, her service record, deployment images, letters of recommendation, her discharge documents, her prosthetic documentation. She assembled them slowly, piece by piece, as if gathering evidence for a trial she hadn't asked for, but had been dragged into anyway. Then she opened a new document. At the top, she typed, "My name is Inez Wallace. I served my country for over 12 years. And she wrote what happened, not just on the plane, but at the gate, in the seat, in the terminal, at the courthouse. She described every refusal, every condescending glance, every moment she had been told without words that she was less. She included Barlow's certification, her seating assignment, and her medical documentation. She included photos. She included facts. But more than that, she included her voice. The one they had tried to erase. The one they had written over with captions and comments and judgment. When she was done, she read it once. Then she copied the text and posted it under her own name on the same platform where the lie had begun. She added a picture, one of her standing in uniform beside her unit on deployment, sand in the air, exhaustion in their eyes. She hit publish. And then she waited. The first response came within 5 minutes. Then another. And another. At first, silence. Then disbelief. Then questions. Then, slowly, comments changed. People began to recognize the discrepancies. They began to read what she had written, some returning to edit their earlier replies, others reposting her message. Veterans spoke up, nurses, disability advocates, fellow passengers. A few said they remembered seeing her. One woman messaged privately and said she had been on the plane 2 rows ahead and was sorry for not stepping in. That she had seen how Inez was treated but hadn't known what to do. Inez replied with a simple thank you. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Her post began to circulate. Not rapidly, not in a viral blaze, but steadily, with purpose, with weight. Her words traveled farther than the photograph ever had. They carried context. They carried pain. They carried truth. And truth, once seen, could not be unseen. That night, she sat in the dark with the screen glowing beside her, Barlow sleeping at her feet. She didn't feel victorious. She didn't feel avenged. By noon, a local veteran affairs blogger had published a breakdown comparing the timeline of her documented boarding, her assigned seat, the airline's known service animal policy, and the original viral post. The result was damning, not for Inez, but for the airline. A discrepancy in timestamps showed that the photograph used to malign her had been taken before the cabin doors had closed, contradicting the claim that she had caused any delay. Another discrepancy emerged. Her accuser, the woman who had posted the photo, had once filed a lawsuit against a different airline for alleged emotional trauma, which was later dismissed due to fabricated evidence. That detail, unearthed by a bored but diligent user, began circulating rapidly. The tide, once comfortably turned against Inez, now receded hard and fast from those who had weaponized assumptions. Corporate silence followed. The airline removed its recent post celebrating inclusivity from its social pages without comment. Calls to their public relations office went unanswered. But silence, Inez had learned, spoke volumes. She didn't seek revenge. She hadn't posted anything more after her statement. But what she had done, intentionally or not, was spark a fire too large to be ignored. Veterans organizations began issuing statements in support. One national organization requested a formal apology on her behalf. Disabled rights advocates joined the chorus, demanding reforms in how service animals were recognized and respected during flights. The woman who posted the original photo made her account private. Screenshots had already spread. No apology came, not publicly, but an unverified account attempted to post a new thread claiming it had all been a misunderstanding. Few believed it, and fewer still cared. Inez watched it unfold with a sense of detachment, not from disinterest, but from the understanding that vindication didn't erase what had happened. It only revealed it. One morning, 3 days later, she received a letter, delivered by courier, bearing the seal of the Department of Transportation. It informed her that a formal investigation had been opened regarding her flight experience and the treatment she endured from the airline's employees. Enclosed were instructions for submitting additional documentation. She followed them precisely. Within the same week, an anonymous source leaked internal airline emails to a journalist. The content was explosive. One message from a senior crew coordinator read, "We need to avoid these optics." Too many passengers are complaining about mixing comfort levels. When we allow visible disability in priority seating, if it escalates, move them. Policy can back us up. Another included a direct reference to Inez's name, with the words "manage presence carefully." The story exploded. Major networks picked it up. News anchors spoke her name with solemn reverence, using her case as an example of institutional bias hidden under polite language. Some tried to soften the narrative, arguing that it was a training issue, but the emails proved otherwise. This wasn't about poor training. It was policy shaped by prejudice. Inez was contacted by several legal groups offering to represent her pro bono. She declined most of them. One group, a civil rights alliance formed by veterans and legal scholars, she agreed to meet, not for revenge, but to ensure that this never happened again, to her or anyone who looked like her. As the investigation deepened, consequences followed. 2 flight attendants were placed on administrative leave. A public statement finally emerged from the airline's corporate office. Too late, too vague, and too rehearsed. It admitted no wrongdoing, but it acknowledged missteps in passenger accommodation. The backlash was immediate. Petitions calling for a full public apology gained traction. Shareholders grew anxious. The stock fell, slowly but noticeably. Investors wanted answers. Within weeks, 2 executives quietly resigned. One was the regional service manager who had signed off on the memo referencing Inez's name. The other was the head of passenger experience, whose silence during the initial backlash had drawn criticism even from within the industry. Meanwhile, Inez kept moving. She didn't attend interviews. She didn't sit for televised segments. She issued one final written statement thanking those who had stood up, acknowledging the emotional toll of the experience, and affirming her commitment to advocate for those who had no voice in these spaces. She didn't want fame. She wanted change. And change, it seemed, was happening. A federal hearing was called to address airline policies related to disabled passengers and service animals. Her name was listed among the central case studies. Senators quoted from her post. Experts dissected the behavior of the crew. Reform bills were drafted. But none of it removed the memory of that day. None of it erased the way her chest had tightened when she had been told to move, or how her hand had trembled when she had reached for a water cup she would never receive. What had happened wasn't about discomfort. It was about erasure. They had tried to reduce her to a disruption. But now, every attempt to minimize her had the opposite effect. She had become the catalyst for something larger. One night, as she walked Barlow through a quiet park near her home, she saw a woman seated on a bench scrolling through her phone. The morning sun broke through the clouds with an unfamiliar gentleness, painting the pavement in golden light as Inez Wallace stepped out of her apartment building, her movements measured, her body still carrying the bruises of the weeks before, but her spine straighter than it had been in months. The air held the quiet promise of spring, and Barlow trotted calmly beside her, his pace light and alert. The scars, physical, emotional, reputational, still lingered beneath the surface, but something deeper had shifted. In a city where she once moved unseen, she now walked with the weight of visibility, a name not just known, but remembered not for controversy, but for clarity, for the strength it took to dismantle a lie that had nearly rewritten her existence. That clarity had forced others to reckon with what they had accepted in silence. The airline, after weeks of stonewalling, finally issued a public apology. This time, it wasn't a blanket statement tucked behind corporate language. It came from the new acting CEO himself, standing behind a podium during a live press conference. He said her name clearly, without flinching. He acknowledged what had happened, not just to Inez, but to others like her whose stories had never made it to the surface. He admitted that policies had been shaped not for accessibility, but for comfort defined by bias, and that the consequences of those choices would now be addressed. Mandatory retraining of all flight staff was launched. Policies on passenger accommodations were rewritten in collaboration with veteran groups and disability rights organizations. A public fund was created to support legal recourse for passengers wrongfully treated, and the first name listed on the advisory board was Inez Wallace. She had not asked for that role. She had not wanted it. But she accepted it not for herself, but for the woman who had sat in silence while her dog was called a disturbance, for the man who had hidden his limp boarding a flight just to avoid stares, for the veteran who had stopped wearing his ID because it led only to suspicion. Her story had become a mirror for an industry and a society too comfortable in its hierarchy of respect. But change, as she had learned, did not come all at once. It came in waves, slow but forceful, reshaping the shoreline one tide at a time. One of those waves reached the woman who had posted the original photo. Her name was eventually revealed, not by Inez, but through the quiet work of others who refused to let lies go unanswered. The woman issued a statement through her attorney, not filled with defensiveness, but with a tone that hinted at something real: regret. She wrote that she had reacted from fear, not of danger, but of discomfort, that she had let her assumptions dictate her actions, that she had chosen to frame the moment in a way that aligned with her bias rather than reality. She acknowledged the harm she had caused. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She simply stated the truth she had avoided until now, that she was wrong. Inez read the statement once and said nothing publicly. But privately, she allowed herself to accept what it was: a step, imperfect but sincere. Months passed. The fury of the headlines cooled. New stories took their place. But the core of what had been exposed remained. The courthouse where she had once been stopped now had a new entrance policy, designed in consultation with disabled veterans. Her image was used, with permission, on a new training module for first responders and transportation staff, a reminder that dignity isn't granted by convenience or appearances, but by right. She returned once to the airport where it had all begun, not as a passenger, but as a speaker. The airline had requested her presence for a private staff seminar, one attended by every new class of recruits. She stood before them in a simple navy blouse and press slacks, her prosthetic visible by choice, not accident. She told them the story, not with anger, but with precision. She walked them through what had been said to her, what had been withheld, how silence and assumption had done more damage than words. She ended not with a threat or a demand, but with a request that they see people, not profiles, that they remember every passenger is living a story they cannot see. When she finished, there was no applause, just stillness. Then, one by one they stood, not for performance, but for acknowledgement. Outside in the waiting area, a familiar face waited. R. Morrow, the original gate agent, now transferred to internal compliance after a review of his conduct. He approached slowly, hands folded, posture quiet. "I wanted to say something," he said. "Back then, I didn't think twice. I just did what I thought was protocol. But looking back, it wasn't protocol. It was preference. My preference. And I'm sorry." His voice was steady, not rehearsed, not evasive, just real. Inez studied him. She didn't offer a smile, but she nodded. That was enough. That night, back in her apartment, she sat on her balcony and watched the lights of the city. Barlow lay beside her, his breathing slow and deep. The breeze was cool, rustling the branches of the nearby trees. The world hadn't changed overnight. It was still flawed, still unjust in places, still slow to admit its errors. But now it had her voice inside it. And that voice had made room. Her story had become a symbol, not just of what happens when we allow bias to go unchecked, but of what becomes possible when truth is spoken not to destroy, but to repair. Inez Wallace had once believed that silence was strength, that not complaining, not resisting, was a form of discipline. But now she knew that real strength is in refusal. Refusal to be rewritten, refusal to be erased, refusal to let the comfort of others dictate the value of your presence. She had not only survived injustice, she had outlived its power. And in doing so, she had created a new space, not just for herself, but for every unseen person who had ever been told they were too disruptive, too different, too inconvenient to be treated with basic respect. She would carry that truth forward, into every room, every system, every silence that dared to speak louder than her truth. The system had fallen, not in fire, but in clarity. And in its place, something better began. Not perfect, but more honest. And that was enough. The end. If you've been following Inez Wallace's journey, we'd love to hear from you. What did you think of the twists in this story? Which part hit you the hardest? Let us know in the comments, and tell us where you're watching from, too. If this story moved you, helped you see something differently, or kept you on the edge of your seat, consider liking the video and subscribing for more powerful narratives like this. Every bit of support helps bring more voices and untold stories to light.